Excellent. So we are super, super excited tonight because we have the opportunity to have a great conversation with all of you and with Cara Page about healing justice. My name is Erica Woodland, and I'm the founding director of the National Queer and Trans Therapists of Color Network. And this is actually the last webinar in our winter webinar series. So we kicked off in December with a webinar talking about telemental health as an opportunity and strategy to increase mental health access for queer and trans folks of color. And last month, we had a really great panel discussion about our own healing as QTPOC practitioners and self-care and community care. And so we're very, very excited tonight to have an opportunity to dive in to a topic that we know a lot of us are talking about and a lot of our community members are hungry for. And for in QTSN, it's actually part of our role to provide opportunities to both educate and be in critical conversation about healing justice, particularly in a moment where it's being co-opted, particularly in a moment where folks are trying to make meaning of how do we heal, how do we center our healing, and how do we do that in a way that's both radical, but also rooted in lineage and rooted in practice and rooted in place. And so we're excited not only for the chance to deepen in this conversation, but this is part of our ongoing work to both politicize QTPOC psychotherapists in particular, and also mental health practitioners and other healers who have the ability to really intervene around harmful systems that are supposed to care for us, but often don't. So with that, I want to take a minute to just honor and thank Cara for joining us this evening. Cara is a dear friend and also was part of our inaugural advisory committee for QTSN. And so we just feel really grateful to have your wisdom tonight and also excited for what you're going to share. So Cara is a Black feminist, queer, cultural and memory worker, a curator and organizer, who for more than 20 years has done movement building and cultural work at the intersections of many movements for justice, including reproductive justice, racial justice, transformative justice, and LGBTQI liberation. She's a former executive director of the Audre Lorde Project, which is an organizing center for lesbian, gay, bisexual, two-spirit, transgender, and gender nonconforming people of color in NYC. She is also the co-founder of Kindred's Southern Healing Justice Collective, which is a Southeastern network of healers, health practitioners, and organizers who are really thinking about how to intervene around violence and intergenerational trauma. In addition to all of this fabulousness, Cara is also the recipient of the Barnard Center for Research on Women Activists in Residence Fellowship, and is doing work around curating public discourse and installations on policing, surveillance, experimentation, and how this intersects with the medical industrial complex. A lot of her work is centered on how do we transform and interrupt medical violence and the exploitation of Black, Indigenous, and other people of color, migrant folks, LGBTQI communities, and really seeing the medical industrial complex as an extension of colonialism and state violence. So we are super honored to have you here tonight with us, Cara.
Yes.
And a little bit about how the webinar is going to be structured so folks know what they're getting into. So I actually asked Cara to start off talking a little bit about how she came to healing justice and kind of who she holds up as the lineage holders for her. And one thing I want to just reiterate is it's really important in a moment of really trying to intervene around appropriation, that we understand where things come from and we name and lift up folks who end up being erased from these conversations. And so after that, Cara is going to do a presentation for about 45 minutes, and then we're going to spend the rest of the time in conversation and having time for questions and all of that good stuff. If you have questions throughout the presentation, please feel free to put them in the chat box. I also want to give a big shout out to Tavia Benjamin, our Healing Justice Fellow, who's also on, is going to be helping us curate the questions and take care of folks via the chat. So that's what we're going to do for the next 2 hours or so. And with that, I am going to ask Cara, tell us a little bit about what brought you to healing justice and who are the lineage holders that you want to honor and lift up.
Yes, thank you. I just want to Really give deep gratitude to you, Erica, and your leadership and just the visionary role that NQ10 is continuing to play in leadership and liberation movements, especially around the intersections of honoring transformative practice through therapies, different cultural care models in relationship to racial, gender justice, LGBTQI liberation, and healing inside of generational trauma. So big ups to y'all. It's been an honor to be part of the history. And then just, I'm gonna try to be brief because I'm almost 50 years old. So when I think about who has come before me, I was like, well, let me give thanks to the ancestors first and foremost that have guided me through this work. And then in particular, just to ground a little bit at how I came to a healing justice framework and practice in the Southeast in the early 2000s based on what I was doing before. So I just want to give a shout out to the Black women's health self-help movement that I was deeply embedded in the 80s, and the HIV/AIDS organizing work that was happening by queer, trans people of color in the 80s that demonstratively shifted how we thought about care in relationship to racial, gender justice, and economic justice in particular, globally. And a lot of those organizers whose names I can't recall everyone, but I'll definitely want to lift up particular organizations like Sister Love, based in Atlanta, Georgia, which held the first Black Women in HIV/AIDS conference in the United States. And I had the honor to work there as an intern. I don't remember the exact year, but in the 80s. And then Sister Song, as that came to be an organization that nationally introduced reproductive justice, led by Loretta Ross, who is a dear friend and mentor. I want to lift up Billie Avery, who led the first National Black Women's Health Institute in this country, which then spurred on other institutes that came to be, including different indigenous communities building health institutes off of outside of reservation federally funded clinics, and building into Latina health institutes, API institutes. The Black Women's Health Project started to spur on work that hadn't been done before by the 1980s. Late 80s. And then I also want to lift up harm reduction as a particular sphere, practice, cultural, political movement that also happened in the 80s, perhaps even in the late 70s, again, led by queer and trans people of color, people with disabilities, and sex workers, who really, I feel, set the standard on what we could consider transformative around care that was based on a framework that was community-led, grassroots-led, sex worker-led, people using addiction as survival strategies, how we led work that was about safety and care and well-being that was critical to our collective survival. And then I just want to give, I'm sort of giving to bodies of people, to individuals, certainly Audre Lorde, who deeply shaped my work, and Barbara Smith, from the Kitchen Table Press, really putting out books in the 80s and 90s that spoke to health and criminalization and Black bodies and queer bodies and women of color that we weren't seeing before with the Kitchen Table Press. I want to give a shout out to my mentors, Ntumbe Howe, who's no longer on the planet, who is a Black queer woman healer and a fierce pro-fat femme, and Akiba Onata Sequoia, who's a deep friend and a continued cultural worker and healer and mentor. All of those people guided me on my path, and many others that I might not be naming. By the early 2000s, I noted that there was a complete deficit in our movements around talking about trauma, particular to how our organizing work was deeply affecting our psyche, our emotional, physical, spiritual well-being. I noticed an increase of Black organizers committing suicide, and how we hold death and grief in our communities didn't seem to be connected to our liberation framework. This is my personal opinion. In the early 2000s, that I felt that to be in movement, to honor death, to grieve, to honor illness, or any kind of sense of well-being, it had to be taken outside of movement or outside of nonprofits, and that didn't make sense to me. And in particular, in the Southeast, where I was at the time, my political home, I was living in Atlanta, Georgia, and started to ask that question to elders who had been through the 60s and 70s, asking, how did you grieve? How did you take care of each other? What did that look like? And how do we talk about generational trauma on a cellular level? What does it mean to be on the front lines for generations and not have places to rest or talk about care models outside of state control? And started doing interviews that led to considering what is a framework that allows us to imagine healing and justice as the same. And honestly, in a meeting around prison abolition, reproductive justice, birth workers, and trans women of color in prison, I was in a meeting with Miss Major and Justice Now and several other organizers, and we were unpacking what does trauma look like in our communities in the early 2000s. And I said, you know, this is about healing justice. I mean, really, y'all, that's really how I came to use that term. People said, well, what are you talking about? Let's talk about that. Let's unpack it. And I said, well, in the South, it looks like, how do we honor generations and traditions of survival and care that are not acknowledged as political strategy? And where are we understanding models of safety and well-being that are not rooted in a state-dependent, state-controlled environment that we know has been based on colonization and has healthcare models that were never meant to build well-being for our communities? And in particular, through a Southern lens, how do we make sure it's not rooted in slavery, in exploitation, and experimentation of our bodies? And then as queer and trans folks, where is safety and where is the honoring of all bodies? And then as people of color, as people with disabilities, where has healthcare ever invited us in to build transformative models? And that really set me on a course of finding who those people were who wanted to do it differently, both inside health systems and outside. How do we build networks or models that allow, or invitations that allow us to tap into resiliency strategies we've used that have allowed us to survive genocide, slavery, and continued colonization?
Excellent.
Yes.
Thank you so much, Cara.
Good question, thank you. Is there another question you want me to move towards, or should I begin?
I think you should begin. I
right.
feel like that was a really good grounding.
Okay. The only other thing that I want to add that I forgot to say is the global community. I had the opportunity to go to Brazil in 2007 for the World Social Forum. I know there are issues about the World Social Forum, but I got there as being a Black queer feminist, organizing around population control, which I'm going to get into a little bit more in the presentation, but essentially meeting with organizers around the world at the World Social Forum that allowed us an opportunity to have conversation around the colonization of land, the criminalization of healers around the world, and actually looking at companies like Monsanto or other big pharma companies, corporations that were directly involved in taking traditions and co-opting traditions. And I had the opportunity to meet with organizers from Brazil and other parts of the globe around the patenting of seeds and genes. And some people might say, what does that have to do with healing justice? Well, when we got there, the conversation was, we are already beyond the patenting of seeds. That's already happened. That happened in the 70s. And with the way that has rolled out, it has permitted corporations, right, to buy seeds that are originally, and colonizers to condemn seeds that were originally a part of many of our cultural communities. But the question we were also asking is, what does it mean to patent genes and to have our genes owned? And so to have a project like the Human Genome Project that directly takes from blood and DNA of Indigenous peoples all over the world, why are we not having a political conversation around the actual healing and reclamation of our seeds and genes? And I just want to say that that was a particular conversation in 2007 that I had never had before, and it changed my whole course on the work in relationship to how if we're not reclaiming sacred traditions of land, of earth, of body, we will not be able to heal from generational trauma if that's not also a part of our strategy. So I just want to offer that as well. So thank you to all those healers and Indigenous farmers and organizers I met in that moment. So I'm going to bring us back to the presentation I've created for tonight. I just want to say it's linear, right? This is a PowerPoint. So I'm very much an orator and a performance artist by trade. So please forgive that there's not going to be performance and a lot of storytelling and some costumes. I'm out fresh out of that for tonight, but I want to get into the deeper foundational work. So essentially, I want to just talk briefly about the framing of healing justice. It's changed greatly since I first started using that term for movement work in the Southeast with organizers and health practitioners and healers as part of the Kindred Healing Justice Collective that formed originally in 2006 and became into existence in 2007. We were very much informed by a needs statement that we'll send out after this presentation. It's pretty full. It touches on many different cultural, political events that were happening at the time, in particular to a Southern context and lens of land, people, healing traditions. And I'm always calling forth other people that I'm learning from. So I want to name, I've always loved this quote by Prentice Hemphill, who's done a tremendous amount of healing justice work inside of Black Lives Matter and in other places in the world. Just quoting Prentice here as saying, healing is being reclaimed from the mouths of those who use it without interest in true transformation, from those who mimic our ancestral practices to accumulate wealth. We are reinfusing the art and practice of healing with our souls, listening to our bodies and to our ancestors, and remembering that we do not heal only for the sake of feeling good. We heal so that we can act and organize. And so we heal so that we can use the lessons gained through the wounds of our trauma to make necessary change in our world. So I want to just lift up that quote. Here we go. The working definition that I'll use, which is also directly informed and shaped by Erica's work and Nkutun's work, is a working definition about healing justice. And I'm borrowing this from the Kindred Healing Justice Collective, again, that was formed in 2006. And really, we didn't have a physical space, but it was a network in the Southeast as a direct response to generational trauma through policing, through healthcare, through a history of experimentation, through the medical industrial complex in the South in particular as part of slavery and capitalism and colonization. So healing justice for today, for the purposes of this presentation, I'm working with that it is a community-led response to intervene, interrupt, and transform individual and collective trauma. And it really is about sustaining emotional, physical, mental, spiritual, psychic, and environmental well-being. Honestly, oftentimes environmental gets dropped or spiritual gets dropped. And I want to say that from the onset, we were very much about what is our lineage to the environmental justice movements of the world led by Indigenous Black folk, to think about where is our spiritual connection and connection to the land. We talked about healing justice as an emergent process, as Erica has mentioned, to address trauma, that it's constantly emerging how we do that, how we transform our work based on how will we respond to grief, crisis, violence, both current and historical. Healing justice also can be or is a political and spiritual strategy, as I mentioned, that's rooted in ancestral legacy. It's rooted in survival practices. And I'm not saying that every ancestral tradition is something that we can all carry forth or agree to or align with, But with respect to what Erica is speaking to, how do we understand spiritual practice and ancestral tradition as integral to our political liberation? And we can choose what those practices are, but how are we rooted in those traditions as part of political liberation? And healing justice is a cultural strategy to honor traditions and create models of holistic care and safety. I've spoken a lot with organizers in South America, East Africa, other parts of the world, and they often say, well, where's safety in this? And I just say, it's embedded. If we're talking about a physical, emotional, spiritual, psychic, mental, environmental way of being, we would hope that we're feeling safe in our collective bodies, that is a part of this. And finally, that it is and will always be a political strategy. How are we decriminalizing communal practices that have been taken, stolen, and co-opted? How are we intervening on the persecution of practitioners? There are health practitioners that have had to hold the line who have been arrested for their work, for even honoring, working with sex workers, working with trans and gender nonconforming folk. Like, how are we uplifting people who have stepped outside of borders and institutional barriers to make sure people get safe, dignified, quality care? And how are we actually looking at the criminalization of our practices and of healers, energy, earth, body-based healers who are still being criminalized for their practices while their practices are being co-opted by white supremacy and being sold back to us by big pharma, right? So all of these things are happening. How are we intervening on that level? And then finally, healing justice as a framework, I'm going to introduce. I know oftentimes some people refer to healing justice as a movement. I know for us at the Kindred Collective, as we formed into a network of, as I said, healers, health practitioners, we found it important to integrate healing and healers inside of political liberation strategy that already existed. So we were already in migrant justice, environmental justice, racial justice organizing, LGBTQI liberation work, so on and so forth, anti-prisons, anti-detention centers. We just wanted to name that healers have always been a part of that health practitioners that were doing transformative work have always been in and out of these political spaces. So we wanted to use this framework to say, hey, how are our movements honoring the integral places healing and wellness have held? So healing justice for us was rooted as a framework of a model of care, that it is rooted in wellness and safety, and that it's survivor-led. It is community-led and survivor-led, whether you are a survivor of different kinds of violence or abuse, including medical violence or abuse, including experimentation, sterilization, so on and so forth. How do we make sure that we are defining what dignified care looks like for each other and ourselves? And in relationship to collective wellness, healing justice sought to confront and transform illness and disease that does not rely on a Western-based medical model. What that meant for us then, what it means for me now, is that it's not based in a Christian, able-bodied, heterosexual, wealthy, white, cis male idea of what healthy and wellness is, right? That if that is the only idea of what healthy is, or without disease, there's no other place for the rest of us to go. We'll always then seen or be seen as illness or disease. So how do we get outside of that and transform that narrative? Healing justice is also rooted in relationship to our collective bodies, and that this is memory work, y'all. Like, how are we remembering the traditions that we've used to get here this far, and what are we trying to create moving further? I forgot to mention Octavia Butler in my lineage. How are we seeing the past to understand the future? This is, I always say, memory work and collective resiliency work. So just to offer, when we think about transformation, and I know it's kind of a real basic visual, but at best, what we're hoping for is if we name trauma, that it's happening. And I'm rooting this in more of a collective trauma frame. Certainly individual trauma is critical to work with always for our collective survival. And sometimes we aren't always looking at our collective trauma as part of movement work, right? As part of work on the ground. How are we collectively impacted by systemic oppression, by systemic violence and colonization? So just naming what collective trauma looks like from generation to generation on a cellular level, how has it impacted our psyche, our spiritual, physical, emotional, mental well-being? And then how does it move into an individual collective transformation? Like if we're not seeing collective trauma, then sometimes I think it's hard for us to touch transformation. So if we're naming, this is our experience of grief, of heaviness, heavy heart, I mean, of any way that we name collective trauma for our communities, how would we then imagine how you intervene on that trauma? And then moving into resiliency strategies, how are we trying to survive collectively? That there is an interdependence that we can build if we are more consciously and intentionally trying to imagine my wellness is connected to your wellness, and so on and so forth. And I want to offer here, disability justice has been a critical movement to the healing justice frame that has often been removed from the conversation on healing justice. And it's central to the conversation on healing justice, because for us, when we imagined using even that term, healing, it was a critical moment to say, we know there's an assumption that some people can be healed, right? Or some people can be changed to be better in their bodies if we're looking at a medical idea of what it means to normalize or understand what a healthy body looks like. And I know for me, I'm constantly practicing and imagining that there is no one healthy body. One healthy is not even in my realm. Like, I don't know what that means, right? To be healthy, I want to explore ways that practitioners are not stuck in this concept of healthy only being able-bodied, again, cis, male, white, wealthy, and Christian. Most often, if you look at old texts, old ideas of healthy, that is the only image that comes up. So until we can change that narrative, and until we can believe that living with all kinds of bodies and living with all kinds of illnesses allows us to perceive wellness as being something much more expansive and on a spectrum. So just to offer that, and I know Icarus Project is on the line and deeply respect their work on mental wellness, right? I know you use different terminology, but mental wellness has been critical to this conversation. And then I just want to offer, again, foundational movements to healing justice framework have been disability justice, reproductive justice, and I'll get a little bit more into that when I talk about the medical industrial complex, environmental justice in terms of reclaiming tradition, honoring our connection to sea, to land, to memory of traditions. And then I want to get into transformative justice. It's been very important if we think about the health models, again, connected to really a system of oppression that assumes that many of us do not deserve to be on the planet, let alone healed or well. So transformative justice allows us to perceive this idea that working inside of state has never been for, by, and about us. No matter how you enter, be it through the medical field, through therapy, through healing, energy, body, earth-based healing practices, transformative justice has allotted us the opportunity, I feel, to say, as community-led, survivor-led, or many of us as organizers on the ground, as healing practitioners on the ground, we want to transform this idea that state models are the only thing that we have to operate through ideas of wellness, and that how are we looking outside of state? How are we looking into community to define what our practices can look like? So transformative justice as a foundation for healing justice has been about safety. And I mean that on the collective level and an individual level. How do we feel safe to be in community spaces that allot for well-being? And then on a collective level, how do we feel safe building collective wellness that can expand ideas of strategies that don't presume one person's safety, but multiple people's safety and needs at the same time. Healing in the same way. Again, these terms are limited. If we can get past an ableist idea of healing, not that you're ever supposed to be perfect or healthy or well, but this idea of how are we transformative and thinking about a spectrum of ways we come in and out of our bodies, ways that we come in and out of being survivors of trauma, and how do we allot ourselves opportunity to have different experiences of different kinds of wellness. That there's no end goal. It's a constant ongoing strategy and process. Survivor-led, as I've said 5 times, very critical is that we ourselves as survivors of, I consider, a violent medical industrial complex, have to reconsider how are we creating practices that aren't based on fear or crisis, but actually based on abundance, based on power, based on shared knowledge and memory. And then self-determination. How are we self-determining, or I should say collectively determining what we want our healing or wellness strategies to look like. Accountability and transformation who do the harm. So critical to transformative justice is that I don't assume that anyone who may have caused harm is not a survivor of harm themselves. So how do we create models of care that don't assume an inside-outside, that some of us deserve it and some of us don't, based on where we may have histories of being harmful to others? But how do we actually hold collective healing processes that allow us to explore different ways we enter, different ways we've harmed others, and how we're all capable of change? And then engaging community in healing and survivor strategies as an intervention. And I'm going to talk a little bit about that as when we come to a close. I wish we could all speak to this. I'm sure many of you have practices, especially for NQTN, right? Engaging therapists, mental health workers. How are we imagining a community of healing and survivor strategies that incorporates different ways, as I said earlier, that we grieve, that we hold process, that we hold challenges in our collective lives? How do we not assume there's only one way to do that? And how do we intervene on systems that assume there's only one model to do that well? And then I just want to move through mapping a survivor-led response to trauma outside of the state. So for instance, if you start here at the center, individual or again, collective model, if a community is trying to determine a response to trauma or their own healing from an incident of violence in their community or in movement, massive incarceration, massive detainment, how do we then move to a communal response? Not only for those that were directly impacted by the violence, but actually looking at who was impacted. Some people call this secondary or vicarious trauma. How were the people who witnessed the violence or witnessed the incident? How are we also taking care of them? Because that trauma it's cyclical, right? So if I'm the survivor of the incident that physically impacted me, but my family who may have been around me and witnessed it, how then are they also taken care of as part of the cycle of violence? And how are we asked to define our own healing strategies that aren't predetermined by a model that says you can heal this way, but instead that we're asked to define that for ourselves based on what feels safe, what feels comfortable, and what feels powerful for us as survivors of that incident. And then finally, how then do we look beyond the incident itself and understand it's not an isolation, that oftentimes as we're survivors of many types of abuse and violence, especially as marginalized communities, as oppressed people, how can we imagine community-led strategies that are rooted in traditions of wellness, that are rooted in understanding generational trauma is not an isolated incident, that we're all carrying histories and lineages of trauma. If it's not going to be the first time and it won't be the last. So how then do we look at community-led models that are going, or practices that go beyond this idea, this won't happen again, but actually that we're actually remembering something that's happened way before us. and how are we moving in different ways to respond to trauma that's much bigger than that individual incident. I'm going to go a little bit into, again, the 4 movements that inform healing justice as a framework. The disability justice movement informs healing justice, as I said, in principle and practice. And I could just be repeating, you might all already know this, but I know that in the past, when I brought up disability justice around healing justice, people say, I don't understand the connection. So I just want to give a quote through Sins Invalid, which I've had the honor to work with as an ally, which is a theater, cultural, political company led by disability justice organizers that I feel is redefining and really playing with the idea of invalid, right, which is a horrible, horrific state violence term, and changing it and pushing on this idea of who is desirable, who is powerful in their bodies, with all kinds of bodies and all disabilities and abilities. And so Sins Invalid, I think, is doing that core work at the front lines. And this is a quote, I'll just read the top part, but able-bodied supremacy has been formed in relation to intersecting systems of domination and exploitation. Not simply within able-bodied normativity or this idea that there's only, that able-body is the best way, but within the violence of heteronormativity, within the violence of white supremacy, within the violence of gender normativity, and within which our various bodies and multiple communities have been seen as deviant, have been seen as unproductive, and have been seen as invalid or as invalid. And a disability justice framework is seeking to push up, right, against that narrative. And they say also, like transformative justice, reproductive justice, environmental justice, this implies a movement building strategy that is anti-capitalist at its core. That we are really talking about capitalism. We are talking about the worth of bodies. We're talking about the worth of who is valued based on who can reproduce labor for capitalism. So this is a great pushback on that analysis. And I also want to lift up some of the key players and leaders in the disability justice movement that continue to add to these bodies of work. Patty Byrne, Mia Mingus, Stacey Milburn, Leroy Moore, Eli Clare, and Sebastian Margaret. And I'm sorry, I want to also say Leah Lakshmi, sorry, her name should be on here, that have begun discussing critical framing and movement work around disability justice that goes beyond a disability rights frame. I'm like, if you don't know, now you know, and please keep reading because all of them are doing brilliant, brilliant work. For the interest of time, I'm going to keep it rolling. I just want to name reproductive justice also as critical to healing justice because more than anything, it pushes up against population control. I'm not going to read this slide. I'm just going to break down what I feel reproductive justice has done to the conversation around normativity and bodies, of course, pushing against the sterilization abuse of so many communities and the actual trying to end generations by physically removing us. But reproductive justice is rooted in an anti-population control frame. And population control is basically that environmental degradation is based on this idea that women of color are the root cause of environmental degradation. And I know that's a very cis frame, but I just want us to all understand what that means for us as our communities trying to survive globally. If honestly, the powers that be are honestly blaming people of color, women of color, people of color's fertility on the root cause of environmental degradation, it is justifiably being used to remove us from the planet. Although it trips me out that they're also trying to take people to Mars now, so that's a whole other issue. But if we think about that, if you look at laws and policies that are based on this idea, this ideology, that we should be, as people of color, as people with disabilities, as incarcerated people, as people, as migrants, so on and so forth, that we're seen as dependent on social systems and as taking away from environment, then why have us here unless we're reproducing labor? So that reproductive justice movement has pushed up hugely against that ideology. And I think that's saving lives. And then just to move to environmental justice as one of the last movement that I think is critical to healing justice is, of course, our understanding and relationship to sacred traditions of the earth. And there is a huge history of people of color being leaders in indigenous communities, especially Black and indigenous women, that led the environmental justice movement. It shifted into the climate justice movement. And unfortunately, I truly believe that climate justice in some ways overshadowed all of the decades of work that had happened starting in the 50s around environmental justice around the globe. And so I just always want to name current work rooted in environmental justice continues to intervene on the displacement of Black, people of color, indigenous, and immigrant communities, including the grabbing of our land, the criminalization of our sacred practices and medicines, all under the guise of national security and a natural disaster-based economy. We could have a whole conversation, and maybe NQ10 will, on what it means to the psyche, spiritual, mental, physical well-being of natural disaster-based economy if corporations and governments are literally waiting for natural disasters to displace legacies and lineages of communities so that they can come in and restart. And what does that do to our collective well-being and memory? I'm gonna dive into the last section of my presentation on the medical industrial complex. Those who know me know this is my favorite thing to talk about. Critical to healing justice as a political framework and a way of being is this notion of the medical industrial complex being just as dangerous to our communities as the prison industrial complex. But for some reason, when we talked about healing justice in the Southern context, we led with this. We were meeting as healers and health practitioners on the ground in different parts of the southeastern region of the US, meeting with doctors, nurses, healers, saying, how are we going to change a system that has dangerously put us in harm's way? Even if we're inside of it, how are we going to change that system? And we recognize that some people needed to explore, well, what does it mean? What is the medical industrial complex? So if we map it out, as I've done here, and there's a couple of different charts. Mia Mingus, Patty Byrne, and I created another chart that's on Mia Mingus's blog called Leaving Evidence, and it's called the Medical Industrial Complex chart. That's very creative, I know. And it maps out how the medical industrial complex plays into sterilization, politics of beauty and desire, population control, eugenics. It's a beautiful chart. I didn't include it here, but I want to say that's a great reference. Again, that's been co-created by multiple people on Mia Mingus's Leaving Evidence blog. The medical industrial complex, for what it's worth this evening, I'm just going to touch on some high notes. So generational trauma, we know, has been directly impacted and facilitated by a system of care that's been rooted in a scientific frame. And I'm pro-science, love science, but I'm not about scientific racism and the abuses of science and medicine that have permitted us to continue subjugating our people to massive interrogation and dangerous practices on our lives. So if we're looking at it as a system, much like the like the prison industrial complex, it is rooted in white supremacy, adult supremacy, patriarchy, Christian, able-bodied, and heteronormative ideas, again, of what it means to be healthy. And as I said, the best way to explain that really is this idea, if you go way back to old science books, if you go back to your public junior high or elementary school idea of looking through the books of what does your body look like, it's always based on this idea, right, of a white, cis, male, able-bodied, wealthy, and Christian-based idea. And what I mean by Christian is that it's often purity is identified as whiteness. Purity is identified as straightness, right? Purity is identified as able-bodied, that if you are outside of any of the norm of what healthy is, you are deviant, you are dirty, you are perverse. That is the assumption. And our medical model has been based on that. So we have a lot of unpacking to do because it's been permanently ingrained, right? And especially health practitioners that have to transform that narrative because the medical system is based on this ideology. So how then are we going to shake it up, right? So if you look at what do we call these? The arrows, yes, bending in between is how do we even look at medicine and and science in relationship to colonization and slavery? How has it been used for colonization and slavery? How has it been used to promote eugenic ideas and population control? How has it been used to build systems of repression and push capitalism onto our frame of being, of well-being? It's just simply having those kinds of conversations and dialogues as healers, as practitioners. It is our responsibility to hold our institutions accountable that we know are using this frame to promote their ideas of healthy. If we can't start there, this is where I think we need to start because it's based on a foundational frame of understanding how oppression fuels medicine and science when it is used abusively. I do believe medicine and science can be used beautifully, but in this case, we are building a system that's rooted in colonization. So I'm just gonna move quickly through Aurora Levins Morales, another person who inspires and is a deep friend and comrade, wrote Kindling, Writings on the Body. It's an incredible book, please read it. A Chicana organizer, queer, disability justice activist who uses her words to take us through her journeys of the medical industrial complex. And that is what Kindling is about, is pursuing other traditions that saved her, not saved is such a funny word, right? That opened up possibilities of how she could live and be in her body as it is. She chose to go to Cuba to do different kinds of natural traditions that help to give her self-determined care and self-defined wellness. So this quote I love to use, what our bodies require in order to thrive is what the world requires. If there is a map to get there, it can be found in the atlas of our skin, our bone, our blood, in the tracks of neurotransmitters and antibodies. We need nourishment. We need equilibrium, we need water, connection, and we need justice. Thank you, Aurora, incredible writer. I've said a lot of these things, but I'm just gonna recap that the MIC is a system that relies on wealthy, white, cis, heterosexual, able-bodied, and Christian ideals of whose body is healthy and whose is diseased, whose is pure, and whose is sinful. Again, giving credit to, they didn't necessarily say it this way, but giving credit to Sins Invalid for their pushback on desirability, beauty, and what is sin, and how to redefine that. Two, prescribing who's expendable. The MIC defines who is deserving of access to quality and dignified spiritual, emotional, physical, psychic, environmental, and mental care, and who cannot access that. The MIC determines whose body is criminalized and pathologized based on a racist, capitalist idea, right? Heteronormative, ableist idea, white and wealthy idea, and patriarchal idea of what is beauty, what is desire, what bodies are fit and unfit to survive and exist only for the purpose of labor and production for capitalism. And four, as an extension of state control and violence, the MIC uses institutions as a platform for surveillance, for policing and erasure of those deemed as expendable, uncured, unfit, and abnormal. All of these things should be in quotes, my bad. And I do want to say in the anti-policing movement, sometimes we have missed engaging, I feel, but it's changing, engaging medical establishments for their policing, engaging health practitioners that have been complicit with state violence. Either it's allowing police to investigate people while they're in bed trying to get care, whether or not it's having ICE come into hospitals to take people as women as they're birthing, so on and so forth. We can name multiple times that physicians are asked to be complicit with state control and violence. So how are we also thinking about the medical industrial complex as an extension of surveillance and policing? I already talked about population control, so I'm going to keep rolling through. Remember, I wish I could say, do you remember what it is? I'm going to say it one more time. This idea that the fertility of women of color and indigenous women, that they are the root cause of environmental degradation because they're reproducing more people of color. The root cause of environmental degradation, y'all, is, I wish I could hear what you're all thinking, war. It's been proven scientifically that is what's killing the planet. I'll push past eugenics. I love to talk about that as well. I'll just say briefly, eugenics as a science, right, to predetermine who should genetically live and who should genetically be removed. This is the base of the medical industrial complex, that the eugenics idea of who is healthy as a human race and fittest to survive is actually, again, based on this idea of who should not survive because they're not seen as healthy. And that's very directly related to the assumption that if you're not white, male, cis, wealthy, able-bodied, straight, most likely you'll have a predilection to be a criminal. And that, my friends, is deeply embedded in anthropology, sociology, science, across the board. You can see a lot of people making these assumptions. I'm right now co-curating a huge project called the Medical Industrial Complex Timeline, and it will show, we hope, ways that different communities have had this eugenic frame of who is likely to be criminal or dangerous based on genetic makeup and DNA. And then finally, sites of practice, ways we are resisting and transforming the medical industrial complex. I just want to give a shout out to the American Public Health Association, which is the national, in the US, public health organization with over 25,000 members, a lot of physicians. I'm not sure necessarily about therapists per se. Actually, I'd have to confirm that with NQTN, but they publicly just sent a statement in the last couple of months declaring police violence to be a public health issue. This is unprecedented. I've had a chance to interview some of the physicians and nurses behind this, and they basically said, we fought for this. This has been a 5 to 7 year process interrogating the American Public Health Association, and finally we were able to align and get this statement out into the world. You can find, if you just Google American Public Health Association anti-policing statement, it's pretty exciting. And I'm not saying that it's like the end all be all, but I'm saying it's a step or a motion in the right direction. So it's an exciting moment. I also want to give a shout out to New York City. After decades of organizing, the city relocated the public statue of Dr. J. Marion Sims, who's known for building the OBGYN medical field on the backs of experimenting on enslaved African women. And they just newly formed the Committee to Empower Voices for Healing and Equity to create a memorial in the place where the public statue was in Central Park. So trying not to be just New York centric. I know there's many ways people have intervened in the medical industrial complex, but I want to give props to a community that's mostly queer and trans folks of color that made this happen. Again, Sins Invalid out in Oakland, California is a performance project incubating and celebrating artists with disabilities. And more than anything, I feel really challenging the normative idea of what normal is, what sexy is, what pleasure is, what desire is, by naming it expansively based on all kinds of bodies, all kinds of genders, all kinds of illnesses and ways of living in our bodies as they are. And then I want to give a shout out to the Queer and Trans People of Color Birthwork Project. I haven't named birth workers through this whole presentation, my bad. They were very much a part of the Healing Justice Framework that we created in the Southeast in 2007 as Kindred. And I know there's been a ton of healing justice and birth justice work over the last decade. I just wanted to name a very important project that's emerged since 2014, starting to create more access to birth education for trans and gender nonconforming people of color. I know there's actually several projects out there. I just wanted to give a shout out to this one in particular. I think they're doing some amazing work on understanding their relationship to criminalization of birthing, criminalization of trans and queer, migrant, Black, POC folk, and where these intersections of what it means to honor a legacy of TGNC POC birth workers from the history, currently, and into the future. And then National Queer and Trans Therapists of Color Network, that I think is intervening on their healing justice model that's working to transform mental health, queer and trans people of color, or working to transform mental health for queer and trans people of color, but also working to intervene on the system of mental health care and how it's been, as we've stated, created literally on the backs of many of our communities. How can we redirect that so that it is self-determined and it is dignified care that represents many ways we are mentally well in our collective bodies? And this work is critical to liberation. And I will stop there. I'm looking to Erica. Can I stop the share? Should I stop share or just go back to the top?
Yes, you can stop sharing and then folks will just be able to focus on you. Wow, I'm over here again my whole life. Thank you so much, Cara. I feel very full. I know you couldn't see the chat. The chat is lit right now.
I'm just seeing it.
And this is a great opportunity to for folks to put their questions in the chat box. I think we have one or two that have already bubbled to the top. What I will do, and because Tavia is going to be helping us with the Q&A, is I will ask a question that I have in particular that we're thinking a lot about at NQTN, and then I will pass the baton to Tavia to take us through the other questions. So I know that you've done a lot of work with health practitioners and mental health practitioners and social workers and folks who are like deeply embedded and invested in these systems and structures.
Yes.
And I would love for you to just share some story about how folks have been transformed. One of the things that we often find is like a lot of us are drinking the Kool-Aid out here. And so even as a therapist, it becomes really difficult sometimes to have these conversations because people, even though they know what we've been taught and how we've been trained is wrong, it's become part of us. It's really hard to shake.
That's right. I would love to give one example. I talked a while back, I guess, and I'll just give a little bit of what do you say, a warning, or if you will. CSA, I was working in Atlanta, Georgia, deeply with a community of organizers and health practitioners around a trigger warning. Yes, that's what it's called. Again, language is limited, but on child sexual abuse. And I ended up sitting down with some researchers who had been doing quantitative, qualitative data of survivors of CSA. And we started to get into a transformative conversation about research, and especially medical research, research around healing, research around trauma. Who determines that type of research? Who gets to be behind the wheel of it? Who gets to decide the outcomes and indicators, and who doesn't? And I went into my spiel on the medical industrial complex, and I was like, wow, if researchers don't know about population control, if you're not thinking about this through a eugenic lens, like if you don't understand the history foundationally of how you're getting taught to research medicine, it's a wrap. So I showed them a little bit more history, and one colleague in particular popped up 9 months ago and said, yo, I'm teaching, I'm not gonna get into their like background because I don't know how public this all is, but they said, yo, I'm teaching at this university. We're gonna do a whole conference on transformative research. I said, what? I haven't seen you for 5 years. And they said, yes, we've decided we have to be committed to what this looks like in sociology and medicine and science, pre-med, all of it. And I couldn't make it there, I'm very sad, but they were showing the intersectionality of colonization in relationship to scientific racism and how you do research. And I'm still waiting for the notes, but I thought that was a really great example. Two, I just toured a little bit with the medical industrial complex timeline that I mentioned earlier that's being co-curated by several folks. This will be public, open source, anyone will be able to get to it. We're doing our due diligence to try to make sure it includes many different communities in terms of who's been tested and experimented on by the MIC. But essentially, pre-med students and bioethicists have been coming to me, and therapists and school nurses in particular have said, wait, where can we have deeper dialogue on the role of MIC in relationship to giving kids, or excuse me, youth, young people on who are being forced to use meds because they're seen as having ADHD or just some of these terminologies of not being able to contain themselves in class. And like, how do you intervene on this assumption of what learning is supposed to look like and what you're supposed to look like as you learn? It's very constricted. So, and it makes cultural assumptions, political assumptions, social assumptions, right? About what it looks like to be in your body. So I just feel like there's a conversation that I've never seen before at a frequency that's really pushing the boundaries. I'm hearing more about nurses, doctors, bioethicists taking risks on saying, we can't keep lying that this is working for us. How are we gonna do this differently? And what is our history in relationship to racism, homophobia, transphobia, classism, just idea of what does healthy look like on all levels, in all systems. And I just did a training for the Planned Parenthood of New York City. And we went there, we talked about the history of Margaret Sanger and sterilization. And it was a very powerful, and we pissed some people off, but we're gonna keep having strategy sessions on how do you change anything from the name of the building, from Margaret Sanger to community or something, and the use of Depo-Provera, which we know for many of us believe that to be a long-term sterilization that's being given out like candy by the federal government. So these are some examples. Is that where you were heading, where you wanted me to head, or?
Absolutely.
Okay.
Absolutely.
Okay.
Thank you.
This
Awesome.
is Tavia. Hey y'all.
Yeah.
I also just want to say too, I think this are out to me that reminds you of like what it means to be human. Like we're having one group define what humanity looks like, and it's spread across the world, and we have to interrupt that. But we have a great question from the Icarus Project.
Thank you.
They said, how do we invite and center into healing justice people that have experiences that are quickly labeled mental illness when that labeling or outing puts them at risk of institutional violence, particularly police brutality?
Mm-hmm. Can you write it in the chat?
Copy it so you can see it.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Hi, Augustina. Oh yeah, and then there's this whole other one about post-hurricanes. I don't see it yet. So, okay, could you say it again? It hasn't come up yet on my, oh, here it is, thank you, it's up top. Yeah. I mean, I was like, Icarus Project, you probably know this answer better than I do. I mean, this is the question, right? These are the questions, right? How do we invite healing justice to imagine? And mind you, to me, the framework was never static. So I know that it doesn't always help folks or assist people in ways that it needs to. You know what I mean? Like, I gave you what I think it is, but politically, what healing justice is, other people toss it. Like it doesn't have what they need. But if we're thinking about people that are quickly labeled mental illness, right, who are, I think there's just this whole piece here, which I think Icarus Project is doing, on intervening on what is mental illness, or like what is mental wellness, like just tossing it out. What our assumption is of what that even means is where I think we need to begin, because it it allows for police brutality out of absolute fear and crisis, that someone should actually be killed at the hands of the police because they have a mental illness. Like this is, we have to redirect entirely, I think, what we are imagining, because that some of the recent instances that have even happened in Brooklyn and some of the community organizing that's happened afterwards, everyone coming out saying, wait, that was my neighbor and we were taking care of them and each other. And then the police came and they had no idea of what that person needed. That was nothing to do with violence. Like something had upset them. So how do we even hold practices and strategies around supporting someone who might feel out of sorts or out of comfort, out of their own comfort, and then they're immediately targeted as acting erratic, dangerous. We just have to unpack this whole narrative. But I'm sure you have more to add to that. So anyone else want to say something to that? There's open floor, no? Or
yeah. So just so folks are clear, we're in discussion time also. And so if you feel comfortable unmuting yourself, please jump in. And also, if Icarus Project wants to talk a little bit about how they're thinking about that question, I think that would be very, very useful.
Oh, interesting. I got another question from Icarus
Okay.
that is pushing for access in these systems of mental health. Yeah, I think this dual-fold, actually. I think there's multiple strategies, and that's what I tried to say earlier, and let me clarify. I don't think there's an inside-outside. I don't think we have time to say that outside is better and inside is better. Transformative justice, yes, informs the model of how do we imagine care outside of state. But I do think, as I think NQTN is doing, there are people inside these institutions that are actually trying to do it differently and transform the model. So I agree, fighting for protecting people from the MIC 10 years ago. I actually think that depends where you are in the country, because I see people still fighting for that. But I also think there is a generation of how do we make these systems work for us? I actually think, y'all, we need all strategies. I think we need both. But as long as it's rooted in an anti-colonialist, anti-racist lens, you know what I mean? Like what I'm not seeing is people making the links to some of the foundational history that's even gotten us here in the first place.
Exactly.
I know there's other questions, so I'm gonna scroll up because it's popping now. It's popping. And I'm sure there's other people that have some answers. The post-Hurricane Maria world, and I just want to bring it back, post-Hurricane Katrina, Rita, we could go so many storms, but as they increase, there's many resources. Not so much about through a social justice lens, like more could be written, but there are some really good resources out there. Let me see, can I ask NQTN just to hold that question for me somewhere after the chat box goes, because I can generate some really good lists. Great, I think, of resources on that. Others, so many storms, yeah. I can unmute. Oh, are you gonna unmute? Icarus Project, unmute so you can tell me what you think.
Hi, everybody. Here I am. I'm in bed already.
Yes.
It's late.
It's late. Thanks for being here with us.
Yes.
Well, thank you for holding this, and thank you for all the work that you do. Yeah, it's a question that we've really been wrestling and struggling a lot with, because you know, our mission statement used to be by and for people that experience the world in ways that are labeled as mental illness, and as our membership is changing more very fast into youth, trans and queer people of color, I love your work, but I follow it silently and anonymously because I don't want people to know that I have these experiences. So I changed the mission statement to something a little more, healing, we do healing justice from this and that. But then and the side effect of that is that we are decentering the people in the mission statement that hear voices, dissociate, have really intense flashbacks. So the question is, how do we maintain those experiences at the center?
Yes.
And reflect that in language while protecting them from systems of oppression. And we don't have an answer. So I thought maybe you all could have thought about it, or maybe you're interested in continuing this conversation together to see what we come up with.
I agree. I think I'd like to continue the conversation. Erica, I'm curious if you have thoughts about this.
I have a lot of thoughts about this. You know, I keep thinking a lot about self-determination and how, you know, my belief is like, our people, we need all the tools, and no tool is going to work well for everyone. And so I think we end up sometimes being in this tension. The tension I'm often sitting with as a therapist when I'm in that role is like medication, no medication, right? And it's like, some people are like, my medication is the only reason that I feel like I can stay on this planet. And some people are like, not for it, right? And so I think there's a way that we need to just lift up that tension. And I do think the tension gets broken down across like generational lines. I think it has to do with regionally where you are. I think it has to do with all the ways that privilege and marginalization intersect. And it also has to do with this kind of really exploding conversation around trauma that's happening in QTPOC spaces. And, you know, that both is empowering folks to feel like I can name my symptoms as like an actual human response to suffering and pain and violence. That is completely normal. If we're going to use that word, completely normal. That is what it means to be human. You should not go through the things that we go through and not have what people are labeling symptoms, right? But it's really just your mind, body, and spirit figuring out how to make sense of things that are senseless. And so I'm really interested in continuing the conversation, but I do think that when we start to get polarized, there's a lot of information in there about why we're doing that, and how do we create a conversation and container big enough so that everybody can participate, because it's really not there's no one size fits all. And I think it's cool because it's forcing us to have more nuance.
Yes, thank you.
Yeah,
Well
I
said.
agree. Like, living in that area of nuance is so important. Just because I think of it, I'm very spiritual and like to think about the Southern practices of conjure and hoodoo, and like using every resource available to us and using every path available to us to get what we need, so that anything can be useful depending on how you look at it and transform it. And I also tend to think, when it comes to the thing you mentioned, Cara, about us shifting what actually is mental wellness, and also like tying together to Erica about like, if you're in this current like iteration of humanity, how can you be well in a time like this? And then two, also a lot of things I think, like when I have friends that do experience some of the deeper or the different types of mental wellness, like you might hear voices or see things or have flashbacks, how we had cultures and systems that held that in different ways, and that has been taken from us. And so
yeah, it's been criminalized.
Right.
Yeah.
You literally they incarcerate you if you hear voices in a psychiatric hospital. And
Yeah.
I think there's this piece too around anything can be a tool, and also anything can be weaponized. So to just say something slightly controversial that I'm seeing right now is also folks who are, for very good reasons, really rejecting mental health care and treatment that comes from these systems, right? And then being like, okay, so as long as it's not Western, it's great, right? And so anything that you use can be used as a weapon and used to create harm too. And so I think that there's some overcorrecting happening in the conversation. And I'm like, again, how do we have access to the things that we actually need and learn how to come back to our inner wisdom, and have community resources so that we can have like a buffet, like an infinite buffet of everything that we could possibly dream of, to move towards healing, which is like, you know, a lifelong, many lifetime process.
Thank you so much for all of that. Yeah, I'm a non-practicing therapist, so at the moment, so I'm also like in and out of systems, and I really like like living in the nuance. I really like that, because it's not a question of yes, medical system or not. It's a question of how and why, and inviting people to be uncomfortable with exploring exploring therapy, right? And exploring the idea of therapy and have deeper conversations about what not all tools are the same. Like, what do you want from it? And thank you so much, Tavia, for naming that these experiences of hearing voices are part of ancestral memory too, right? Because they're experiences that have lived forever. Mm-hmm. So yeah, so this is really helpful. And I come from a framework of psychology of liberation, which also invited us to recover the memory of the people. And I think that that's a really, really good way to do it, to think these experiences has always been there, how we dealt with them. So thank you for giving me so much to keep thinking about this. Thank you.
We have, you're welcome. I love this. We have another question from Morgan B. It says, how do we deal with the tensions within communities regarding medication versus not medicating? There's so much discussion in QTPOC healing spaces about using natural, holistic remedies and supplements, and I tend to feel so ashamed for being on SSRIs or pharmaceutical medications. How can we ease this tension within our communities? I face backlash for remaining on my medications and going to therapy versus doing holistic healing, and I have a hard time combating this, even from Black and Indigenous people, as well as trying to deal with internalized stigma. So how do we deal with that discussion and the stigma of taking medication versus not?
I see that Morgan said it was answered down
Oh,
at the bottom.
I'm sorry.
But no, it's okay. I do think the question was necessary to say aloud, and I appreciate it. And that's what I meant in saying, I think, and what Erica said, I think it takes all kinds. I also want to bring into the mix cultural workers, spiritual practitioners. I think it takes all forms of ways that we're thinking about healing or wellness. I think it's so important that it's self-determined, and that we are choosing what feels safe, what feels powerful, what feels well to us, and that we can't stigmatize. I say in the healing justice, it's interesting to me in the trajectory of healing justice when it first started for us, the Kindred Collective that started in the South, very much in response to Hurricane Katrina and Rita, because we saw so many of our people directly impacted by the natural disaster of the policing, incarceration, and shooting happening on live television post the storms. The storms was the least of our worries. And to watch people do what they needed to do to be in their bodies, all sorts of things, we looked at it through a very expansive lens of what are the tools and the practices that we have just to offer, like you said, Erica, a plethora of things without any stigma attached to whatever it is you're choosing. But how do we make sure for us as practitioners or healers that we are constantly transforming our ways of thinking about providing care that doesn't get stuck, static, boxed in, and assumes that we know better for people that know better for themselves. Yeah.
That question and the discussion that it sparked, it actually makes me think about a question that I have, which is, like, what are the exciting opportunities, but also what do we need to be worried about, and what are the threats in terms of this like budding conversation around healing justice and all the excitement around it. And I do think that there's this threat around, then it becomes anything like therapy and medication bad, and then everything that's not that is good. And we know, there are a lot of practitioners that are not great practicing other things as well.
Are you just opening that up for conversation?
I would like to. Obviously I want to know your thoughts.
Okay.
But I definitely want to see if there are other folks who want to either put their comments in the chat or speak them into the space.
It's wild to multitask because I'm like, oh, I'm in the chat box, and then I'm like, okay, what's going on? So say the last part of your question again. There's some great comments over here.
Yeah, it's really like, what do we need to be concerned about, looking out for? What are the threats?
Oh yes. Wow. Let me ponder this for a second. I'll see if anyone else wants to jump in. I have some thoughts. Hold on.
I have thoughts. Just not a random thought. I actually think a threat can be, I'm not even trying to be like victim blaming, but I want us to actually start claiming what we really want. Like, I feel like when I tell people that I want us to actually trace back, like, people created this problem. We created racism. We created these things because people wanted to figure out how to dominate someone else, or one country decided to dominate the world and kind of subjugate the whole world underneath their heel. And I think we should be more expansive about what we want and claim that. I think people want to like keep moving in incremental steps, and this moment feels very powerful. I'm like, no, we can ask for it all back. We can ask for it all back. And why are we not doing that? And I keep being in spaces like I'm fighting hog farms in Eastern Carolina, or when we talk about healing for ourselves, or when we talk about policing, it's like, why are we not asking for folks to not be in our communities? We've lived here. We need to shift how we are experiencing being on earth. It's like, if you live where you are, like, it just is really wild to me that we live in a time where, you know, so many people are willing to accept what is told to you, or you can't, like, the rules, like, oh, this is really impolite, or like, it's going to be hard, it's against the law. Like, things that legal are actually things that are right or moral, or things that actually lead to people's well-being. And it's like, we have books, we have all of the history, centuries that say this isn't working and it's not right. So I'm just really confused when people like say that we can't change, so that we can't, especially on like a local, state level. I'm like, there are a lot of really innovative things happening, I think, with different departments, like health departments and stuff. People are trying stuff on the ground because they see that it's not working for our communities. And like, where I'm at, I want that to thrive. So I think I want people to start asking for it back and start creating it in their lived situations instead of like voting for the president. I mean, like, that's a theater. Sorry, I'm going to go on my own political soapbox. This is Tavia speaking. But I want people to really imagine and push themselves out and like, what do you want to create, and do it now? Because like, if you don't create it now, we're not going to get it in the future. And so that's what I feel.
Yes, I do believe this is memory work, and it's also dream work, right? So it's remembering the traditions that we forgot. I call that rememory work, right? Because we had it, but we forgot it. And that's part of the colonialist plan, to forget it, not remember it, and not use it again when it was working. But then also to imagine and dream what's going forward. What do we want to create, right? And I also want to say, in relationship to the chat box, is funders, philanthropists, donors that have been limited in their ways of funding one shop, one idea of a modality that does all for many. It's never worked. It's never worked. I always say, if someone stood up in front of you and told you how to organize, I do not believe people would be like, oh yeah, that's it. That's the way to go. I was like, why? Why then does that work on wellness? And I was like, oh, because we feel super vulnerable. We don't feel like experts of our own self-determined well-being. And we feel like someone else is supposed to tell us how to be better. So why not? Why not trust that there's one model that's going to tell us how? And it's almost like our defenses go down. We're like, wait, do you have the answer? Because that's great. But it just would look so differently, I feel, if someone told you this is how we're all going to organize in every part of the world. I was like, that's a wrap, people. We would never go for it. So why do we think healing modality is going to be the same thing? And philanthropists have deeply, deeply impacted only sending streams of resources to one type of model or group. And I think that's a challenge. So it's like, how do we multitask? How do we have multiple strategies? And how are we elevating different ways and things that people need? Because what we needed in the Southeast after Katrina and Rita is not what, not what Puerto Rico needed after Maria, not what, we can go on and on, but it's like, there's no one symptomatic response. That deeply works against who we are as dimensional beings.
Mm. You know, that last piece just made me think about our responsibility as folks who are committed to healing justice, folks who have initiated projects, and folks who are practitioners to intervene when that happens. So I've been doing a lot of thinking about how we have like a network of networks, like how do we actually make sure that our relationships are so strong that if a funder tries to prop up in Qton and say, oh, you're the golden child, right, which is, tokenization, at the expense of all the others, right? So when we're in rooms, we talk about Icarus Project, we talk about QTPOC mental health, we talk about kindred. So we have to name each other and say, hey, we know each other, we collaborate. Oh, you trying to give me some coins? Well, what about Beam, right? So I think that's one strategy that we're constantly using, but I think that that needs to be a mandate for folks as part of this bigger explosion around healing justice, is that like we already know how this works. People with power and privilege, they have about 5 strategies that they just remix over and over again, and then we keep falling for them.
Right. Oh, that's so real. I love that, because I think that also speaks to what Cara and like all the different work that's done around like speculative fiction around Octavia Butler. Like I feel like all the stuff that she pointed out around like hierarchy and also intelligence, or just how like in all of her books, everyone who had to overcome had to be connected to each other, and they had to be rooted. It's just, and also had to deal with change in a way. I think it's just like, it's why it feels so real. It's like, dang, that is, you called it. But I like that whole like moving information, because I think the way that philanthropy works, yeah, I wish we would make more ecosystems of change. Like, how do we mimic how nature works? If nature doesn't, everyone has a role, and everything is different, but there's a role for it when it's in balance. And these funds of money are just kind of almost acting like, just, they can disrupt so much. And yeah, anyway, that's a different tangent. Oh, thanks. Yeah, y'all should say some things. It's such a quiet chat. What's going on? Oh, RJ has a question.
I could jump in real quick.
Yeah.
I've been listening and I'm sitting with it, and I do environmental justice work. And within that framework, I'm always thinking of how supporting like Black and Brown communities, especially like queer and trans folks, and something I'm like learning within it is like, how are we going back to ourselves? Because we're socialized to go outward. And we really, like you said, it's like we really need to be going inward. And understanding our sense of self and our sense of self-worth, doing that work is one of the most transformative parts of us actually like moving forward with change. So that's something I've been realizing is within the work of environmental justice. It's like, I've been going outward for so long that and then that's actually the model that we're taught, is like to go outward with our energy, and we actually need to bring it inward, sit with it, and just like really figure out how to gain that sense of self. So this is really important stuff.
Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you. Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Carrie. Sorry, Cara.
I just was gonna say, for us when we were organizing around, in particular between 2009 to 2012, a huge amount of laws, anti-immigration laws that were happening. I'm not saying that didn't happen again, but that particular moment in the Southeast, particularly Georgia, North Carolina, South Carolina, I was organizing with Southerners on New Ground, Project South, just really powerful institutions, Highlander, what have you, that were holding the ground for migration justice work in relationship to Black-led and migrant justice work. How do we move together in formation? And we were called in as healers to hold particular moments around crisis intervention, be it trauma from police, tear gas, to counter demonstrators attacking people emotionally and physically. And what we created were these holistic teams, a nurse, a healer, and someone to bring down de-escalation, trained in therapy or safety de-escalation, who could help people ground. And I know you're not necessarily speaking to like that kind of crisis moment, but it became very important to us as a political practice to actually have tools for people to strategize how to take breath at the most heightened critical moments of their organizing work. And what does it mean to be able to ground yourself as a spiritual political practice, to be able to know, I don't feel safe in this space right now. How do I move myself out of it? If you can't physically get out, what can I do for my body in that moment, be it breath, be it holding on to an object, different things. I'm a sound healer by trade, so how sound and vibration moving through the body through different breath, how it can bring people back to center, back into their bodies, so that they feel like they can move and navigate whatever crisis situation is happening. So just kind of riffing with what you're saying, that became very important to our holistic model of care at crisis moments inside of rallies, massive demonstrations, where we can't assume that everyone most often don't feel safe. They don't want to be in a crowd, but they believe that they want to move with the pack and the formation. So they put themselves in spaces that they may not have always been aware that actually frighten them. So that became also a part of our political work and training up song staff, project staff, what have you, saying, how are we going to be prepared for folks who literally cannot breathe in the face of danger and oppression?
That's powerful. We have another question from RJ. RJ says, I stand in this weird space of providing pastoral care as a person of faith to QTPOC folk and not being ordained. In regards to the conversation earlier on Christian supremacy, can you say more about how to hold the tension of knowing the institution of the church and its legacies of colonization in the global South and organizing church folk in the South who have church hurt? They say, as someone who does faith justice work, it's a struggle.
Yes, I'd like to offer some thoughts about that. Is this Reverend Jen? If it is, awesome. If it's not, if it's someone else, awesome, great. But I was just curious. So I just want to say that rooted in the South, particular to my political practice, and also the original or initial ideas of Kindred Southern Healing Justice as a collective, we crossed paths multiple times with faith-based spiritual practitioners, and wondered, had always that question, right, of how you, especially working in queer, trans, gender nonconforming, POC spaces, how are we going to hold this particular lens of Christian supremacy and places where people have found faith to be a gathering space to find safety, to find collective wellness, to find collective spiritual questions. How do you hold the line on those things, both coexisting? And I do feel it goes back to this stigma piece, right? Like this idea that spirituality or religion cannot be a place, or faith cannot be a place where people find political practice or find grounding or find healing. And it can be a place that's absolutely not healing. So we found ourselves having constant cross dialogue on holding what we call opportunity. I'm like, well, how can we imagine naming Christian supremacy in Christian-based spaces and finding ourselves able to work with folks who are willing to work at the intersections of interfaith, racial, gender justice, migrant justice, LGBTQI liberation work, if they're willing to have the question about impact of Christian supremacy as an institution of colonization and faith as being a way for people's collective survival. Does that make sense? Like I am finding that is where I can have the most positive impact, is having conversations with folks that are willing to hold both of those complexities at the same time and not doing just one or the other. But I do think people are having that conversation. I absolutely do, especially a lot to learn in a Southern context of how that's been held for generations.
Mm-hmm. Sorry, as a Southerner, I just want to also weigh in. Because I feel like I grew up in the church too, and like my faith and spirituality was always grounded in nature, but also in the church. And I feel like that's something I carry with me, even though I'm not actively in the church right now. I feel like the magic of the church, or like when the team of religions, is all spiritual work, but it doesn't matter. Like the institutions and what they do, you have to be accountable for that. But especially if you're a colonized person, like if this was like, a faith that you were introduced to and you found some faith in it, I think we kind of provide the magic to it, and how you use it is what's true for you. And I think if you also look back to Christianity's like true starts, or the history, like really go back past when they created the Bible, past when they like kind of tried to create what they needed to create, Christianity was like Jesus was like flipping tables. He was coming for establishment. He was coming for government. So like, I think if you go back to where it was started, it was actually a pretty radical spiritual practice. And I feel like, yeah, I had to make what I wanted of Christianity when I first kind of got to it. I also started to see that a lot of religions and archetypes, there were a lot of the different cultures kind of create similar stories. So I don't know, that's kind of getting meta with it, but I feel like if it comforts you and it's a tool for you, like, follow your faith and know that it can be used for other things. But like, you know, that's just how double-edged things are with humanity and how, you know, I don't know. That's when to stop this ragged thought. I'm going to stop my talking now. But I love you, RJ. You're great.
I want to just add a thread to that question, because I think I didn't grow up in the church. I was educated in Christian schools, all through elementary, middle, high school. And so when I end up having this conversation where this tension comes up, especially as a QTPOC person who's like deeply spiritual, but like church as an institution, not my jam. I often encounter folks for whom that is their jam. It's like we don't actually do enough to unpack and understand the system of dominance that's rooted in violence still, right? And you know, obviously it's not just Christianity, but it is I think that's, to me, where I'm excited to have more conversation, which is like as your individual practice is like super personal and super important, and you want to feel affirmed in that, but then how do you hold that like your individual practice is connected to structures and systems that is literally out here causing a lot of violence and harm? And like, how do you resolve that tension in yourself? But then how do we actually just really talk explicitly about that, even as folks who are marginalized? So RJ, that question is everything. Thank you so much for the work that you do, but also for posing it, because I do think I'm in a lot of spaces now where people are kind of like very much rejecting Christianity, and then they're like, everything's about astrology. And some people are like, I don't want to talk about astrology. So it's like, we can enact dominance with anything. And I'm really curious about, again, how do we have a big enough container where people can bring the traditions that are important to them in their multiplicity without us being like, and now we're going to have the astrology church, because I'm an astrologer and I don't even want to go to that church.
And you're right. I wanted to say in my presentation, I mentioned Christian supremacy in particular because it has Christianity has a particular lens on science, body, purity in ways that feel very integral to Western-based models of medicine. But I think to what Erica just said, we're talking about religious fundamentalism, which can happen across the board, and different faith-based practices can make assumptions about body, can make assumptions about wellness. I'm just talking particular to an institution, that being a Western-based model, just to clarify that.
I love our webinars. We get on so many different tangents. It's beautiful. Let's see what's going on in the chats. Any questions? Any reactions? Feelings? We can also breathe together. It's great. Thank you, Augustina. Again, but astrology is starting.
Astrology church is starting. People are disclosing their signs and their rising signs, and then it wouldn't be an Incutin event without evolving into a conversation about astrology.
Yeah. Do you want to read that question, Erica?
No, go ahead.
Okay, thank you. Latietta has a question. How can someone be trained in healing justice work?
I'm gonna say one little thing about that, and then I'm sure there's other ideas. Love the question. Mentorship. Thank you, Augustina. I was just gonna say, when Kindred first began, and again, I don't think Kindred is the end all be all. Like, we didn't start healing at 2007. Let me be clear. When we created a collective, a body of folks that we could learn with, build skill with, imagine something different, right? And remember from the past, as I mentioned. people started calling us from across the country saying, wait, can you come to Iowa? Can you come to LA? We got calls from LA, different parts that said, come teach us healing justice. And we just said, what? We were so confused. We're like, what you want? You want a model? You want a book? What does that mean? And they said, well, just come tell us what you do. And I was like, we are mainly trusting our intuition and our ancestral knowledge of what we believe to be true in the context of the South. And I have, my people are from the South, from Georgia and Florida, but I was returning to the South. I'd only been there for 20 years and I was still earning my way, finding my way in my political home in the Southeast. And folks who've been there all their lives said, I don't know my traditions. There's no way we can come to LA and tell you yours. So we say, look to mentors, look to land, look to memory, look to your understanding of what it is we're trying to create and imagine. And then let's have a conversation in a year and see how far you got and what you learned. So just to be really honest and forthright, I think this is an open dialogue. I don't think there's one model. I know that I'm doing a training on the medical industrial complex, particular to a lineage of healing justice, because I think that history isn't getting named. And I think there are strategies that we can build off of it. And I think in QTPOC, doing some other kinds of teachings or learnings. But you know what I mean? I think these are multiple strategies and there's not one way to train this. There is a Healing Justice Institute or multiple that I've seen. I don't find them to be rooted in community. And I find that ironic since my whole presentation was on community-led, survivor-led power, but to each their own.
I also think something that our friend shared earlier, I forgot your name, the other environmental justice friend that was talking about finding your inner guidance. I feel like what guided me towards healing justice work is really, doing that grounding and making it a process of my day and how I live my life, like to ground so I know, or can be more sensitive and more aware to what I need to do and what I like and what I respond to and what lights me up. So I feel like that kind of guides what healing practices I choose. And then I think, and also kind of having a good sense of yourself too can help you figure out what are things, which I mean, I don't think a lot of people get, how can I describe this? Get the space, especially if you're QTPOC, to think about, hey, what am I good at? What do I like? What is my body like? How do I feel? But I feel like a lot of things that at least, and I'm also a Cancer moon, I'm emotional, or like I have feelings. So I think what guides my work has to be my feeling and emotions. So that's how I connect to it. But I think like kind of learning yourself and sitting with yourself maybe can also help you figure out what in healing justice or what type of healing work, if you want to do healing work, is the right modality for you and how you can figure out then who to learn from or what community to group yourself in to kind of start your journey.
I really love this question also because there's no one route, there's no one way. And I feel like when I found healing justice, I was like, oh, this is what, it made everything that I was doing make sense. And it provided some kind of integration for me because I felt really, I was like, oh, I'm a healer and I'm doing this political work and I'm a therapist and I'm an organizer, and it didn't feel aligned. And then I was like, oh, I felt just like my nervous system really calmed down. I was like, okay, it's all here. And so I do think there's this piece around mentorship, which can sometimes be hard because a lot of our mentors and our elders, we don't have access to them because of structural violence, right? And I think it's really, really important to look at how it's already happening in your life. Look at the threads and tendrils that you can follow that are not external to you, because, you know, I didn't know there was a Healing Justice Institute. That's slightly scary.
My point, exactly.
No shade. I have no idea who's doing that, but I'm like, that's terrifying. I was going to tell everyone to go to Cara Page's university.
Right? Claim it. Bring it in.
We just got a full-on conversation in the chat box. Hold.
Yeah, okay, let me get to this reading. Thank you, Mandana. I hope I'm saying your name correctly. I apologize if I did mispronounce it. I hope to be a mental health practitioner in the future. I just graduated college. Congratulations! You made it. I was really concerned about my future schooling in mental health counseling because I did notice my therapist had some assumptions about mental illness and wellness that were ableist. I also had issues because I'm a gender non-binary South Asian person, and they had a binarist, transphobic lens of what mental wellness looks like. I feel like I have to go out of my way to look for information that are anti-imperialist and anti-colonialist. I also work as a peer counselor for DEQH, which is a South Asian LGBTQ helpline. I had to look for information that was not a part of the canon of psychological research to be adequately affirming to our callers. I really want to know how we can be trained in healing justice because I do not think it is part of counseling psychology training. Also, I do need schooling to be a licensed therapist. What do I do to be aware of harmful parts of schooling and to be a safe member of QTPOC community? That's a
mic drop.
Multi-layered question. Yeah, that's everything.
I'm gonna hand that to you, Erica.
Okay, awesome. Because I was like, yes. First of all, where do you live? Let's talk. Literally, let's have fun.
Hi.
Yay.
Yeah, that's me, Mandana. My pronouns are they, them, theirs. And yeah, I'm in New York right now. I live here, and yeah, I am a call taker for DAIC, which is a South Asian LGBTQ helpline, and I have noticed that when it came to texts or the texts that I've read in undergrad, I majored in psychology, and the texts that we have read, the kind of instructions they give or the way they describe how to talk to a client, how to provide psychological support, and how to have this, partnership with a client, it really seems like they're telling you to talk down to someone, and they also have, they need you to, it seems like they need you to make the client okay with oppression, or to make them okay with oppression enough that they become a quote unquote productive person, or have, the type of job that would be respectable to an upper middle class white person who is probably, straight and cis. And, it seemed like I definitely I want to be a licensed therapist, so I have to do schooling. But after seeing the type of schooling I got in undergrad, I'm honestly concerned about future schooling. And I was wondering, how do I go about looking for resources that would make me a safe member of the QTPOC community, that would, let others know, let folks in the QTPOC community know that I am someone who will see and hear them, and not be someone who will honor their lived experiences, because they are the expert on their lived experiences. And I wouldn't be like, okay, I'm the expert in mental health, so you got to do what let's say. How do I go about looking for information? Because it seemed like I had to look for this webinar, look for stuff, it was not something I would have been aware of if I did not look for it.
Right.
Also, I'm grateful for this webinar. Thank you so much. I loved everything that was covered. So, yeah.
I really, really appreciate you lifting this up. I think one of our political agenda is to mobilize and do kind of a re-education of mental health practitioners. But what I would say as somebody who survived a social work program right here in Baltimore is that find your community in the institution if you choose to go that route. And then more importantly, stay really grounded in community outside of the institution, and just know that, any schooling you go to, they're programming you, they're socializing you. And if you are accountable to your people, then it makes it a lot easier to be like, nope, I'm not going to integrate that. And then there also are a few of us who are in these institutions who are really, really, really resisting. And you will find those allies. But if you're looking for it in that system, you're never going to find it, because the field is very, very conservative. And it's taking a long time for them to acknowledge really basic things like it's helpful to have a therapist that's the same race as the client. Like that's still up for debate in psychology. So to just know it's a conservative field and it's changing. Go ahead.
I just want to offer, oh my gosh, I just lost my train of thought. I love these conversations flying back and forth. We have to create it. I mean, I don't know if I said it enough, but what grounded me to even get to the work that Kindred didn't exist. Something existed, but it didn't until I asked the question, who else is interested in transforming ways that we want to organize around generational trauma? Go, stand up, like move towards me. Let's move towards each other. That's why I named like the harm reduction, not so much organizations, but people that came together, organized different ways to intervene on harm or HIV/AIDS when it was completely racist, sexist, homophobic, all the things. Like we just had to move towards, there's got to be a different way to do this. And so I know sometimes it's about energy. When you're in school, it's overwhelming. But I also want to say that I do think there's like-minded individuals who actually are wrestling with these same things. And I do think the conversation is much more on a higher frequency right now. It's easier to touch, but I also know there's a lot of people that aren't touching it. So I just want to invite us as this group of beautiful people on a Thursday night can ripple out, right? And keep asking questions. Because as I said, like even having the timeline to move with, I'm meeting people all over the country who just say, wait a minute, I'm on that timeline. My family was tested on. My mother was sterilized in Puerto Rico by the United States government. Like there's like so many ways that people are touching, but they have never been asked the question. We've never been invited to self-determine what it is we want to see for our well-being. And we're gonna have to build it, y'all.
Say so.
We're gonna have to build it. And because you're in New York, I do want to invite you. I'm giving a presentation, a talk, Shake It Up, Let's Rattle It, Transforming the MIC on March 7th at CUNY Grad Center. So the Women's Studies Department invited me to come and talk for a couple hours so we could shake it up. I was like, let's do it. So March 7th, and I'll send it to NQ10 so they can pop it out. But I'd love to have you meet more people so we can ripple out, because it's so much bigger than all of us.
Oh, I would love that.
Awesome.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
We have one last question from Kala. This is, how do we, and I hope I said your name correctly, how do we integrate our different lenses, languages, and ways of understanding within this white-centered paradigm of healing? Meaning, there are established legal and ethical boundaries that act as part of state surveillance and control and dictate how we can approach healing. For example, a therapist who may not ethically be able to incorporate root work or energy healing. How do we holistically protect ourselves in doing work that directly confronts systemic violence?
Is this particular to therapy or being a licensed therapist, or I'm just curious?
Are you still on the line? Would you like to unmute yourself? Okay.
Hi, I'm still here. So it doesn't have to be, I'll put on my video too. I'm chilling in my bonnet, so.
All right.
Thursday night.
Hey, okay. So not specifically to therapist work, but just those of us who are both a part of Western system and also engage in other traditional or other forms of knowing and knowledge.
I know that I've been, there's, as much as NQ10 is working with therapists and social workers and other practitioners, there's been a huge gap for nurses and doctors. So I've started to do trainings with some other folks, with doctors and nurses in particular, because they got really left out of the conversation, and that got complicated because we never meant to leave them out. They were initially part of our strategies in the South from the get. So what we've noticed is there's a project that I worked on with Tamika Middleton called Black Women Birthing Resistance. And it very much uses the trajectory of birth workers as a perfect example of this, that were healers, right? Held emergency, held death, held life, moved into a system of care that was very restricted, but they still had their things. They're not their ways of knowing, beautifully said. And so they were doing things at risk of losing their jobs, but they were doing things. So I think there's need to have some more conversation about strategy, because I think there are a lot of practitioners that are needing to double up a little bit on what they're offering access to. It's not on the side, but like in Western-based care, they're figuring out strategies that help them do things integrated in their practice. So I'm like, I don't think it's any particular magic, although I think we have magic. I just think people are getting real creative and have been creative for a long time, is in our lineage. So I guess I want to offer, how do we create space for that conversation on how folks are navigating and doing what they need to do inside of these spaces, inside of prisons, inside of clinics, inside of detention centers. I'm telling you, people are getting real creative because they don't want to be complicit with what is going on. And that's what I'm interested in doing more mapping of, because I think that's not getting spoken to or said for, for protection, for safety. But where do we put the stories down so people know, oh snap, I need to try that. You know what I mean? It's right. A level of risk and strategy.
Yeah, that makes me think again the importance of building community and connection and that mentorship to pass down these different strategies and stuff. Because that strategy is exactly, I think, what I'm trying to figure out now. I recently just graduated my master's program. So now as I'm working towards licensure, I'm finding that it's just the strategizing of, okay, well, how do I bring this in a way so that I can continue to do the work and also not put my bag and my own livelihood at risk, in very real and tangible ways. So thank you.
Yeah, we don't have quite the answer yet. I know it doesn't really answer your question, but I think you're not alone. That's the best I can say. Like,
that helps.
We have to map these things. We have to map them.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you so much.
So true. Wow, y'all. It is 9 o'clock if you're on the East Coast. It is 6 o'clock if you're on the West. First and foremost, I want to thank all of you for such a generative conversation, for such excellent questions, and for being with us today, and for the work that you're doing to support healing justice in your own communities and in your own lives, and in yourself, most importantly. So much love and gratitude to Cara Page, comrade. Thank you for being with us.
Yes. Thank
you. So much more to come. So much more to come. A few housekeeping pieces before folks hop off. So you will get a follow-up email early next week that has links and resources, and also a link to the recording. We're going to share that with everyone who's registered for this, even if they couldn't attend. And you will also get a link to an evaluation of our webinar series. So if you participated in this webinar or any of the others, we want to hear your feedback. What did you like? What do you want more of? This was a pilot, and so we hope to create more spaces like this, so y'all can come together and we can keep having this good discussion.
Yes. Thank you for this beautiful space you've created. Fantastic.
Excellent.
Yes, it's an honor.
And there are a lot of other groups who are doing fabulous work. We've named them. I threw some links in the chat box. There's resources. So we want to also just give respect and lift up all the other folks who are holding this work that you might not know about. But yeah, if you want to stay connected to InQTN, we're on Facebook, we're on Twitter, we have a newsletter. And we really, really love bringing folks together to just really radically push what it means for us to heal and be free. So thank you so much. Have a beautiful evening. And we'll see you soon.
Beautiful. Be well, everybody. Be safe. All right. Bye.
Thank you.
You're
Thank
welcome.
you.